Yay! I'm done with Twilight Imperium. That was really a miserable experience. So I was asked to kind of discuss, I wrote Blake 7, and since it was by the guy who introduced me to the show, and I'd heard of it before, but had never actually watched anyone. And since my upload time is really slow, I figured I'd clog the pipelines with a little bit of discussion about it. Because I really, really enjoyed it to the extent that I, watched one episode and then went back to the beginning and just ran my way through in a fairly short time. I wasn't completely addictive about it most of the time, but it provided for a nice break between games. So, anyway, it's actually really hard for me to say what I liked about it, except I think it's very similar to what I liked about the old Star Treks, and never really felt the same about, say, Doctor Who or the newer Star Treks, for various other reasons. But there's this sort of really almost cliched character portrayals in it. But in an enjoyable, almost humorous sort of way. And I wanted to go through all the different characters because of that, because I think that showed some really interesting aspects of it. So that's a big part of it. The fact that it's got a science fiction basis, that matched the kind of science fiction basis that I kind of wanted. Even more so than, say, a Star Trek would. So Star Trek, serving the Federation or whatever the hell it is, and, trying to do good in all this. And in Blake 7, they start out there trying to save their skin. And, Blake is something of a revolutionary and an idealist, and the Federation there is portrayed as this really, really evil force. And it seems like a total dystopia. But still, this concept of, this evil empire, as it were, which is totally oppressing its people, being revolted against by what are, for the most part, common criminals. Blake is the definite exception, or one of the few definite exceptions, as a very political prisoner who sort of infects all the other starting cast members, maybe just because of his own charisma or whatever. That's certainly how it's portrayed. I don't find him terribly charismatic. I actually found some of the other characters much more so. It reminds me a lot, because of that, of Freedom in the Galaxy, where most of the characters are pretty much dregs, or in Star Wars, where you have Han Solo, who's not exactly the cleanest guy in the world in it, and some of the people that they're dealing with. But then Star Wars gets a little too moral in terms of the message that it's trying to portray. And other than Han and maybe Lando Calrissian, most of the good guys seem pretty good. And even the ones who aren't terribly, aren't completely the knight in shining or armor type, they still come across as a little better than, thieves and murderers as it comes, which is what Blake 7 is really made up of for the most part. So that's appealing. The conflicting desires within the group, yet still being driven onward by someone who has these ideals and who kind of ends up infecting them all with them to some extent or another. I mean, they continue on after Blake's gone to do really what his goals are, all except maybe one character who seems to... But he still tags along. I mean, he could have gotten out at any point. There's no question there. So, that's kind of an interesting play there. Then there's kind of these devious traps that the chief baddie, who's the Servalan, the supreme commander to begin with of the Federation Navy or something like that. She's very interesting in terms of showing these sort of plots within plots and everything. And usually it's done in a fairly believable manner. Sometimes you feel like too much, she's revealing too much in exposition, but I guess, I think this came after Dune. I'm guessing that they learned their lesson there not to use the constant thinking aloud kind of mechanism that was used throughout Dune, and I think really, really worked poorly in terms of trying to maintain some flavor to it. On the other hand, there were certainly times where you would say, no, man, she wouldn't tell them that, right? All right, so let's look at some of the characters, and I'm not quite sure where to start. I suppose I'll start at the top with Blake, because he's your political prisoner. He finds out, he was leading a rebellion at one level or another, and then he gets captured and forced to recant and brainwashed, and his parents are killed, his family's killed, and he has every reason to hate the Federation and to really move against them. But he doesn't really have a face at this point, and there's nothing personal. And to tell you the truth, there really never is, other than one character who's in, I guess, the first 2 seasons, Travis, who he doesn't really hate, I don't think. He keeps leaving him alive because Travis is predictable. On the other hand, Travis hates Blake and wants to kill him, and is probably liable to make mistakes because of that or whatever. At least that's kind of how it's portrayed, that Blake puts it. Travis believes very much in setting these intricate traps and trying to lure Blake in so that he can kill him. And in a couple of cases ends up, letting everything go and losing everything for the chance to kill Blake, man to man, at least where he can see that he's killed him. So beyond that, some of the original crew, so you got Villa, and he's kind of this cowardly thief who's just sort of tagged along and is very, very good at what he does, but not really good at anything else. And he's sort of the comical sidekick throughout the whole show. The butt of a lot of jokes, including his own, and that works kind of nicely. That's something, you kind of have in, say, Star Trek, in both Spock and Bones, but never to such a derogatory extent. I mean, Villa is clearly, and as it gets to the last season, it actually becomes, I think, less, because in the earlier seasons, it always seemed like everybody kind of liked Villa, but as the show went on, people liked him less and less. You got the feeling that the barbs directed at him were more meant. Now, Avon all along has throughout the whole show always flung things at him, but you got the feeling he cared about him in some weird sort of way. And that, on one of the shows, that definitely seems to disappear completely. One of the other originals was Jenna, who's a smuggler. She came across very weak to me as a character throughout the entire period she was in it. And, supposedly a good pilot, but never seemed really to do anything impressive as a pilot, as opposed to Del Tarrant, who shows up later in the show and is clearly a very good pilot. He does things that impress people. Jenna never really does, and you feel like she was underused throughout the entire thing. She also seems a little too unmercenary. In a number of positions, Avon approaches her with some sort of deal, hey, let's get out of here while we have the ship, or this, that, and the other. And every time, she feels a little too loyal for how she's kind of portrayed or what role she's in, etc. It just feels strange to me. Then we have Gan, who's this kind of gentle giant type, but not very gentle. He likes smacking people's heads together, and he's being shipped off because he was a murderer. But he's gentle because he has this chip implanted in his head, which prevents him from killing. So, he can just, grab two foes and disable them at once. And again, he's kind of, I think, was underused. And that's one of the reasons they get rid of him as well, I think, in the series. He wasn't sparking things as much as some of the other characters were. He wasn't clicking quite as well. He and Villa got along well, but that's all there was. Now, Avon. Initially, he comes off as very self-serving. Very, very, I'm along here until I can find something better. The truth of the matter is, it's very clear as the show goes on, and especially later on, he's become completely devoted and in love with Blake, even after Blake's gone. He'll do almost anything for Blake still, or for the idea of Blake. And you almost feel like he's maintaining this rebellion. It's not, with the money they have on the Liberator early on, with the freedom that they have to escape somewhere, they could make new lives somewhere and be effective. And I think that's kind of the choice with Villa, that he keeps saying that they could be safe somewhere, but he doesn't want to give up the friendships. With Avon, you almost get the feeling he doesn't want to give up the thought, the goal that Blake set throughout the entire thing, because he's the one who's pushing them on to take risks, to do more and more as they go, all the while arguing he's not an idealist, and I don't think he is. I think he's just tremendously loyal, and you can see that in the very last episode, and I'm not going to give anything away here, but he there's no way that he is not, is still in love with Blake in some way, and just cannot bear the thought that maybe it's not mutual. A little bit later, we get Callie to join, and at first she comes across as kind of this very, capable so there's one thing with Avon. He's tremendously capable at just about everything. His archetype is that of a computer swindler who can, jury-rig a computer and set up bank swindles and stuff like that. But it turns out he's tremendously competent in combat, and just tactically minded better than almost anyone else. His innate mistrust makes him usually the guy who saves the day, although later and later in the scenario he starts being the one taking risks and other people are saving him more and more. Callie also came across on your first meeting as this really, really competent militant and a revolutionary, a telepath. Just sounded like such a great combination. I felt like she became really integral to the crew during the time that she was in there, and sort of the voice of mercy, which didn't fit what you met on the first day. What you met on that first day struck me as almost the most bloodthirsty, and combat capable of the bunch. But it turned out far too many times she was just the heroine in distress, and able to give warning, I need help, using her telepathy. But I felt that didn't work terribly well. I would have much rather the very bloodthirsty killer that she first seemed like she was going to be. Let's look at the computers. The first ship's computer was Zen, and he's on the Liberator. Didn't have much of a personality until towards the end of his tenure there, and even so, he just wasn't. It was always an inferior computer to the other one, which was Aurak. And Aurak, would play these games. He'd have his own goals. He'd be setting stuff up. He'd, be spiteful and go sulk. He was a lot of fun, and it worked very well as one of the characters. And then the third computer, Slave, was very, very much the humor computer. Let's take Aurak's type of personality and take something else, another position, but put a computer in this where he'd use different ways of trying to get his way. You tell him to shut up and he shut up, and then, tell you something completely unimportant before something important, because he's kind of pissed at you. Which was amusing, there's no question of that. And he was even more spiteful in some ways than Aurak seemed to be at times. But still, absolutely, unlike Aurak, absolutely had to do what you told him. Aurak would sometimes just refuse. Now, for the bad guys, we've already talked a little about Servalan. I had a problem with a few things. So she completely uses sex and her charisma to rule the empire, the Federation, as it were, to get her way in everything. Not necessarily sleeping with people, but just using her aura of sexuality. But she also was always expounding her plots, and sometimes too much. I certainly saw one case where I felt, why would you even tell this person? This isn't someone you need to impress what you're doing. And it's not someone who needed to know. I think usually, though, it felt like about the right level. And she had also a certain unwillingness, especially to kill Avon. I felt that there was always this weird, nobody would quite commit to, was she trying to turn him or just use him for a short while for something? And that was never clear in the show, but I think the final episode shows what decision she would have made eventually, probably. Travis, I've already talked a lot about him. He's vengeance, and not terribly competent. He was a very shallow-seeming character, and I think he gave a sort of atmosphere to the first couple seasons that the whole thing was almost a joke. The whole show, very, very camp. And I thought that was very enjoyable. You get away from that in the later seasons. It begins to take itself more seriously. I don't know if I'm happy for that change. I think I kind of liked the campiness. Then we have a few later entries to replace crew members who went on to better things. The first of these is Dana, who again came out as, right from the beginning, she seemed like she would be this awesome female combatant who could master all weapons and master unarmed combat. And in general, she was generally used to make the statement of, well, you're only a woman, you can't beat a man. I found that very disturbing, to tell you the truth. The show is 1980. Clearly, I think that they didn't need to use her and misuse her as the weakling that they kept portraying her as. I think she should have just kicked ass. And it was very saddening for me to see how they worked her. Del was an interesting foil for Avon, really. He came in the position sort of to replace Blake, but nothing like. In fact, he was more of a match for Avon in terms of being ruthless and unscrupulous seeming. But not really. He was more, and his looks probably led him more and more towards this as they wrote him particularly into the series in the 4th season, as opposed to fitting him into a role. More as kind of the pleasant rogue, the James Bond type in some cases, although not as competent. And he's enjoyable, very pleasing to watch, but something just didn't work for him. He didn't have the sort of gravitas to replace Blake, that's certain. Now, Avon more or less took that role on, and I don't think Avon really matched it either. I have a lot of trouble believing that everyone would have stuck on with Avon there. And I have a lot of trouble believing that Del accepted being sort of the rebel to Avon the way he did. It felt just wrong to me in some ways. I'm not sure how to put that. But it just didn't play right in terms of... I honestly didn't believe that... Yeah. It didn't feel right. The final was Sulin, who in a lot of ways actually was the first female who really was more of the real combatant. She could outshoot everyone. She still got herself caught in the help me position a few too many times, and I believed it less from her than anyone else, actually. But there were a couple of points where she came across as a little harder than everyone else, and I liked that a lot. The only person who ever came off... So Avon comes across as cold, but not as hard. Not as willing to just kill. In fact, you kind of got the feeling that early on he just was not that used to killing, even if he was still very good at it. Later on, it just became, old hat to everyone. But, I thought she worked rather well, actually. Early on, she came out feeling too weak, but as things progressed, unlike some of the others who I think showed strength early on and then kind of drifted away, she actually built up into a more interesting character, and I would have liked to have seen where she went. in the same way that maybe I'd like to have seen where Slave might have gone. But yeah, most of the characters dropped were, I think, for good reason, in terms of not really fulfilling their role. Obviously, Blake, you always kind of felt like the character as portrayed by the actor, and I don't know actors' names, was not as strong as everyone believed him to be. He was playing to a role that maybe wasn't completely accepted. You looked and said, I just don't buy that they continue risking themselves to this degree for him and his ideal. With him gone, I think he became more of a force because of how strong, and I actually think that I actually remember a name here, Paul Darrow, playing Avon, portrayed that feeling. I think he did a very, very good job of taking the absence of Blake and really putting it into the right feel. What would I have liked the series to go to? What did I almost expect it to go to? I almost expected it to go to... there was definitely a shift after the Galactic War. Instead of that shift, I was expecting them to start winning. I think that would have been interesting. It might have been harder to handle, though. But I think it would have been so cool to have faced maybe, and this just is pure speculation, but Blake becoming a Messiah-like character to going from planet to planet, or someone else, and becoming that real figurehead. I think that would have been an interesting way to take it, and to see maybe power corrupting him, or everybody thinking it's corrupting him when it's not. I think those would have been interesting examples to show. There was another point where Avon goes back to Earth, searching for his lost love or something. And I thought that ended kind of weird too. Kind of like the final show did, actually. In terms of, there's something very weird in his character that I can't quite grasp. But this, okay, if you betrayed me, even in the slightest amount, you're gone. No matter how much it hurts me, no matter how much it destroys who I am, or whatever, you're gone.